Good evening, all. Can't see any one of you, but I'm still happy to give this talk. I will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we can take some questions and try and give them good answers. So last week, we learned about the great hopes and expectations that the poet Yehuda Gordon Yalag had regarding the integration of Jewish society and culture into Russian society and culture during the 1860s. However, towards the end of the lecture, we saw that by 1871, Yalag was already afraid that a young Jewish generation followed his call in such a radical way that he was afraid that soon enough there won't be anyone to actually read his modern Hebrew poetry because nobody will know it at all. But in any case, by the 1880s, all the great visions and dreams of the Haskalah movement in Russia did not materialize at all. They were, for the majority of Jews in Russia, they were no more than dreams. One can clearly say that the Russian government and most parts of Russian society never accepted the Jews, definitely not as a full society, into Russian life. And soon enough, in a time of crisis, both Russian government and Russian society turned against the Jews, and in a most terrible way. And this is what happened. Let me share the screen for one moment. Despite the reforms he led, Tsar Alexander II, we mentioned last week, was considered too moderate in the eyes of liberal and radical intellectual circles in Russia, and therefore he provoked a strong opposition. In the late 1870s, a revolutionary movement called Nagornia Volya, in free translation, the will of the people, gained power, calling for more changes and progress in the Russian Empire. And the Russian government arrested and tried hundreds of members of this movement, and this led to a response of terrorism, and they reached their peak in several failed assassination attempts against the Tsar. And after a few of these attempts, he was actually murdered, as you can see in the picture over here. This was in St. Petersburg in March 13th, 1881. The Tsar was murdered by a student from this radical movement. And right after this act of terrorism, a very famous assassination in modern European history, a wave of anti-Semitism ran through Russia. And now historians are have different opinions about the reason for this wave. Was it organized by the government, or was it some kind of spontaneous act? But in any case, Jewish life mainly in the southern parts of Russia was filled with attacks against Jews. In fact, a wave of pogroms, which are known in Jewish memory as Sufot Banegev, storms in the Negev, storms in the southern part of the land. Many Jews were killed, wounded, etc., etc. And for many circles in Jewish Haskalah, this was a major turning point, like some kind of sign for them that all their great expectations and hopes were in vain. And they have to now look for a new direction where to lead the energies focused on the future of the Jewish people. In any case, we know that 1881 became one of the most important dates in Jewish history, similar maybe even to the year 70. the date of the destruction of the Second Temple. And basically, from this date onwards, we can trace the two most important developments in modern Jewish history that in many ways shaped Jewish existence as it is today. And of course, I mean, the first process was the Great Migration from the Pale of Settlement to many places in the world, but mainly to the United States. Excuse me for the Hebrew words on the map. This is a map I use usually for teaching, but even if you can't read the Hebrew, it's, I suppose the arrows do the job, and one can see that there was, and you probably know this very well, a huge movement, a huge migration of Jews from this very poor and sad place in Russia, the Pale of Settlement, to a few places around the world, and many Jews, more than 2 million, moving to the United States of America, making New York the biggest Jewish city in the world, leaving Warsaw way behind. And of course, the second historical process or movement that started to develop after 1881 was the beginning of modern Jewish nationalism. So if you excuse me, I'll leave the experience of the Great Migration and the establishment of the modern Jewish life in America to a different course, or maybe a different teacher, and I'll have to focus in the next few minutes on the development of modern Jewish nationalism, which developed into Zionism. So again, we don't have enough time to go through the whole story, but I do want to mention the most important developments that happened between 1881 and 1903, the year we have to focus on this session, the year of the Kishinev pogrom and the poem of Hayim Nahman Bialik in the city of slaughter. So I'll just say a few important things to give us a clear historical context about what we about to talk about. So between 1881 and the beginning of the 20th century, we find mainly in the Russian Empire and in a few other places like Romania, the creation of the Chibat Zion movement. Not a very big organization, definitely extremely small if you compare it to the massive movement of Jews to America, but still an important organization who promoted practical migration to Eretz Israel, Palestine as it was called in those days. For Jews who didn't have the ability or the will to move to Eretz Israel practically, establishment of a quite important network of schools and a beginning of a modern Hebrew culture with first signs of national poetry, literature, and things like that. In Eretz Israel itself, in the history of Zionism, we call this period from the early 1880s until the beginning of the 20th century. This is the time of the first Aliyah, with the establishment of a few new settlements in Eretz Israel: Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov, Rosh Pina, Rehovot, Hadera, Gedera, and other places. They all exist today. Some of them have become very big cities in Israel. But in the time we're speaking about now, they're of course very small settlements with no more than a few hundred residents, but still a very important development in Jewish history in general, because such a thing, establishing new Jewish settlements in Eretz Israel, was something that didn't happen for many hundreds of years. So those are the days of Chibat Zion and the first Aliyah and the establishment of the first Moshavot in Eretz Israel. But of course, the most important development in modern Jewish nationalism came in the 1890s with the the miraculous appearance of Theodor Herzl. We won't describe over here how exactly he came from his specific background and education and career to devote himself completely to the Jewish cause, but we do have to say a few words about his importance. So Herzl published his book, The Jewish State, in 1896, leading to the first Jewish Congress in 1897. Let's read just a few sentences from this very important book. And Herzl writes, "The question of Jews is not, in my opinion, a social or religious one, even though it has garbed itself in one of these forms. It is a national question, which will be solved only if we make it one of the political questions in the world, whose secret will be discovered in the seat of the civilized nations and peoples together. We are a nation, one nation." So if you take these words of Herzl and compare them to the ideas of Bialik we discussed last week, you can see, of course, a complete different approach to solve the Jewish question, a Jewish problem of the 19th century. Bialik was searching for some kind of social and cultural assimilation in Russian society, and he was looking at things from the East European point of view. Herzl was living the central of Europe with Western concepts, and he, after thinking about anti-Semitism both in Western Europe, both in the Russian Empire, he reached the understanding that the only way to solve the problem of Jewish existence in modern Europe is defining Jews as a nation and creating a nation state for them. So after he came to this conclusion, Herzl devoted the next 8 years of his life until he died quite young in the age of 44. He led the Zionist movement, which he actually like really organized it by almost by himself, and became the one-man diplomat in service of the Jewish people, trying to gain, according to his plan, a recognition from one of the great European powers and empires of the time to get a sovereign territory for the Jews. So it's quite famous. He approached the Sultan in Turkey, the German Kaiser, even went to the Russian government at some stage, but eventually by 1903, he was focused on efforts to try and get some kind of help from the British Empire. And we're now really looking at the last months of Herzl's life. And during the winter and spring of 1903, he was mainly focused on a British plan that was offered to him called the El Arish Plan. So this was a proposal to settle Jews in the area of the Sinai Peninsula. This was a few months before the very famous Uganda suggestion from the British Empire. But then in the spring of 1903, in April, very close to Pesach, a very important event happened, important and tragic, and this was the great pogrom in the city of Kishinev, the capital of Bessarabia, a southern part of the Russian Empire. The pogrom went on for 3 days. Almost 50 Jews, 49 or 50 Jews were killed in it, and many more hundreds were seriously wounded. And in fact, the pogrom lies on a very long series of attacks against the Jews in Russia, but it stands alone and it is still very famous. And the reason for this is that this was, first of all, the first pogrom in the 20th century. And second of all, this pogrom for the first time was covered by modern journalism, modern press, with photography and the world of telegraph. The events in Kishinev were brought to the attention of a Jewish public and general public in New York, London, and other places, with the coverage of newspapers and different, quite a few photographs. For instance, this photograph, and thus you can see over here, of course, the murdered Jews covered in talitot and all their relations and neighbors standing around them and looking at this horrific scene. So in fact, this was the first time in history, after more than 1,000 years of different attacks against Jews in Europe, that you could actually have a photograph of what it looks like, what happened. And this new factor was a deep change in how Jews around the world understood this kind of experience for Jews in Russia. So the pogrom in Kishinev had a very big effect on Jewish life all around the world. And in fact, in August, a few months later, when Herzl got to the last Zionist Congress he attended, he came up with this idea to settle Jews in Uganda. And what promoted this suggestion, which was of course very problematic, was the fact that Herzl had a very strong feeling that this kind of pogrom could happen again and again, and there's a serious sense of urgency in the air, and one has to bring any kind of solution for the Jewish problem before it is too late. And he didn't succeed, because most of the delegates to the Zionist Congress wouldn't accept the idea of settling Jews in East Africa. And a few months later, he was already dead. But still, the Kishinev pogrom, and one has to keep this in mind, is the historical background for this great debate of if to accept or not to accept this British offer of Uganda. Of course, a very great debate that escorted Zionist thought for a long time afterwards. In any case, moving to a different part of Jewish existence, Kishinev pogrom was a shocking experience for Jews of the city who lived in the city of Odessa, not so far from Kishinev, a very important social and cultural center of Jewish life. And the leadership of Zionist Jews in Odessa decided to send a delegation to Kishinev to find out exactly what happened over there. And one of the members of this delegation was a young Hebrew poet who named Hayim Nahman Bialik. At this time, 1903, he was in his early 30s, already gained himself a name in the Hebrew world of letters as an important poet. And he was sent over there as part of this investigation to collect evidence from Jews who were in the pogrom, try and find out exactly how this event took place, how the Jews respond, etc., etc. And Bialik, like many other members of this delegation, walked around the city of Kishinev, interviewed men and women who went through the pogrom, He had a very thick notebook. He took notes about what was going on, and then he left Kishinev. But the interesting thing is that his notebook, or this diary he kept about the Kishinev pogrom, wasn't published, and he never wrote a real account, like a realistic account about what happened in Kishinev. Instead, he sat down and for a few months worked on this poem, which we'll read now, and thus turned out to be one of the most important poems in Jewish history entirely, from the days of the Tanakh until modern times. So the poem is called In the City of Slaughter, in Hebrew, Be'ir HaRiga. And like we did last week, I will read a few stanzas from this poem, and you can follow me with the English translation over here. And then I will say, I think, two important things about this poem. We can have a little discussion about it with your questions afterwards. I'm sure you'll come up with your own ideas and observations about this text. So let me read it and then say a few things about it. So, of course, this isn't the entire poem. It's much longer, and you can look it up. I think you can find it easily, definitely in the Hebrew. Assume the English full translation is also available. Kum lech lecha el ir hariga, uvata el החצרות, ובעיניך תראה, ובידך תמשש על הגדרות, ועל העצים, ועל האבנים, ועל גבי טיח הכתלים, את הדם הקרוש, ואת המוח הנקשה של החללים. ובאת משם אל החורבות, ופסחת על הפרצים, ועברת על הכתלים הנקובים, ועל התנורים הניתצים. במקום העמיק כרכר המפץ, הרחיב, הגדיל החורים. מחשוף האבן השחורה, וערות הלבנה השרופה, והם נראים כפיות פתוחים של פצעים אנושים ושחורים. אשר אין להם תקנה עוד, ולא תהי להם תרופה. וטבעו רגליך בנוצות, והתנגפו על תילי תילים של שברי שברים, ורסיסי רסיסים, ותבוסת ספרים וגבילים. ואתה, לך והבאתיך אל כל המחבואים, בתי מחוראות, מכלאות חזירים, ושאר מקומות צועים, וראית בעיניך איפה היו מתחבאים אחיך, בני עמך, ובני בניהם של המכבים, ניני העריות שבאב הרחמים וזרע הקדושים, 20 נפש בכור אחד ו30 ויגדלו כבודי בעולם, ויקדשו שמי ברבים. Okay, so these are, it's hard to find the right word in English or in Hebrew to describe the power of this poem. But let me make two remarks about it. First of all, referring to the first three words of the poem. Kum lech lecha. So in English, arise and go now, etc. But of course, the English doesn't deliver completely the biblical, the Tanakhi sense of these three words. Kum is a calling to a prophet. God, or the muse coming from the inside, is urging the modern poet to rise and say what he has to say, as if he is the prophet of today, of modern times. He has to take the role of prophecy. And Lech Lecha, of course, very obviously taken from the commandment of God to Abraham. Lech Lecha, in the book of Bereshit, Genesis, is the opening or the beginning of Jewish history. And I think in a very deep sense, what we see over here is Bialik, the poet and the prophet, looking at the pogrom in Kishinev and having this very deep sense, this deep feeling that this has to be a turning point in Jewish history. Something new must begin now because things cannot go on as they are. Okay, so one can really feel the power and energy and urgency, this critical urgency in these words, Kum lech lecha. You have to say this as a prophet, and you have to start something new after you experience this event, this pogrom in Kishinev. Something new has to begin. My second point is it has to do with what Bialik describes over here in Hebrew as Tvusat Sfarim Ugvilim. I'd say in English, the defeat of books, as if to say Bialik was, of course, a great poet, a great writer, a great admirer of Jewish books. He based most of his career on teaching and working with Jewish books, but over here, probably something he saw in his own eyes, Sifrei Kodesh, Jewish books, different sizes and shapes, thrown around in the streets of Kishinev, and this is a site of defeat. As if to say the books didn't have the power to save the Jews of Kishinev from their fate. This isn't enough. And from this point, he moves to a very disgraceful, or at least he's describing a scene which is full of disgrace, looking at young Jews who are, instead of fighting back against these the attackers are hiding, and these Jews that are in a hiding place are Bnei Bnehem Shel Maccabim, yes, the sons of the Maccabees, as if to say, look how far we've traveled from the times of the Maccabees. We have become this powerless people. It has something to do with the defeat of books. And there's something disgraceful about it. This is something one should be ashamed of. I think this sense of what we call in Hebrew busha, shame, is very present in this poem of Bialik. And it's true that this poem became very famous in a very short time, and really became one of the most important poems in Zionist circles. And this sense of shame and the sense of urgency to the understanding that something like Kishinev shouldn't repeat himself, thus promoted the organization of different Jewish defense forces, both in Eastern Europe and then in Eretz Israel during the time of the second Aliyah, which we will discuss next week. I want to show you over here a few quotations from a book of an important historian, Stephen Zuckerstein, who wrote quite recently a book about the pogrom in Kishinev and its outcome. And over there, Zuckerstein describes Hayim Nahman Bialik's Be'ir Hariga, in the city of slaughter, the most influential poetic work written in a Jewish language since the Middle Ages. And the most powerful aspect of this poem was this discussion of the shame, the disgrace that's involved in the existence of defenseless Jews and the importance of this being changed. So this was, of course, a very important part of Zionist history. Finally, I want to mention one more aspect of this, the acceptance of the sperm and its fate, and thus is the Russian translation of the poem in the city of slaughter, Be'ir Hariga. So last week, we discussed this new Jewish generation who started its life in the 1870s, 1880s, young Jews who grew up almost completely disconnected from their Jewish roots, definitely from the Hebrew roots. This is the generation Yalag was worried they won't be able to understand him anymore. And of course, one of the most important individuals of this generation was Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was born in the city of Odessa in the early 1880s, and by the time of the Kishinev pogrom was in his early 20s. He was like the most beautiful example of a new Jew living in Russian society and culture, and he could easily be one of the greatest writers in Russian in the 20th century. However, for different reasons I can't go into now in detail, Jabotinsky came to a deep understanding that he does not belong to Russian society and not to Russian culture. He met Herzl once in that last Zionist Congress where the Uganda proposition came up. He met Herzl over there for the first and last time. He admired him very much, and he adopted Herzl's idea about the fate of the Jews and devoted his life until he died in 40 years later to the Zionist cause as one of its greatest leaders. But besides being a political leader, Jabotinsky was, of course, a genius in the field of literature, a writer, a poet, and a very important translator from different languages to Hebrew and from Hebrew to other languages. And Jabotinsky was the person who translated Bialik's poem in the city of slaughter to Russian, and his audience was this generation we've been talking about of young Jews who didn't know Hebrew anymore because they were moving so fast into complete assimilation in a Russian society and Russian culture. So Jabotinsky brought this poem to them, and by that drew many of them back to a Jewish and then a Zionist identity. Jabotinsky himself, as a poet, wrote an introduction to his translation. And this introduction was a very powerful poem by standing by itself. So let me read it over here, and you have the translation to English right beside it. So he himself, Jabotinsky, as a young man, also traveled from Odessa to Kishinev sometime after Bialik and his delegation. He also saw in his own eyes the scenes of the pogrom. And like Bialik, who obviously saw Jewish books scattered around the streets and wrote about the defeat of books, Jabotinsky's eye noticed the same thing. And he writes over there, בעיר ההיא, in that city, Kishinev, ראיתי תוך סחי, פיסה אחת מגביל תורה קרוע. Okay, so he saw a piece of a torn Torah scroll, exactly like the books Bialik saw. ניערתי בזהירות מקלף נצחי, so he shook carefully the dust from the eternal parchment, this piece from the Torah, את האבק שבו היה זרוע, he shook the dust, and saw over there, ושם כתוב בארץ נוכריה. He saw two words from the Tanakh, from the book of Shmot, Exodus, בארץ נוכריה. This is the description of Moshe giving giving a name to his son, Gershom. Gershom, ger hayiti be'eretz nochriya. I was a stranger in a strange land. So this was the part of the Torah Jabotinsky found in the dust in Kishinev. And he writes over there, רק שתי מילים מספר עם הנצח, just two words from the Tanakh, from the Bible. בשתי המילים הללו חבויה היסטוריה של כל פרעות הרצח. The problem of the Jews in the entire history comes out of these two words, the fact that they are in a foreign land, be'eretz nochriya. Now, in Jabotinsky's biographies, different biographies, this is told again and again, and I have every reason to believe this is not just a legend, but the truth. Jabotinsky carried this small part of the Torah scroll he found in Kishinev. He took it with him everywhere. And years went by, and by 1915, this was already World War I, the great First World War. Jabotinsky was a journalist for a Russian newspaper. He was traveling Europe, reporting about the war. And in 1915, he got to Egypt to write a few articles for his newspaper about the Turkish Empire and its involvement in the Great War. But over there in Egypt, he met a very big group of young Jews, most of them from the Zionist movement, who were just expelled by the Turkish regime from Palestine, from Eretz Israel, to Egypt, which was under British rule at the time. And when Jabotinsky saw these youngsters, he also met the leader, the very admired leader, Yosef Trumpeldor. And these two gentlemen came up with an idea to create a fighting Jewish force in the British Empire, in the British Empire's army, in order to fight the Turks, help conquering Eretz Israel, and then as a reward from the British Empire, receive some kind of autonomy or even a state in Eretz Israel. So you can see over here what Herzl was working on before the pogrom Kishinev came again in a different shape to Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor's mind. And as it's described in history books, Jabotinsky took out from his pocket this torn small piece of the Torah he found in Kishinev, waved it in front of these youngsters and urged them to join this Jewish fighting force. And this is what happened in 3 years later, in 1918, the Jewish Legion under British Army, with Jabotinsky himself as an officer in the Legion, entered Eretz Israel. And when that happened, this was the first time in more than 1,000 years, and even more than that, that a Jewish fighting unit fighting for a national Jewish cause was actually organized and took part in the taking over of Eretz Israel from the Turkish regime. And this came with the Balfour Declaration, and of course, a completely new stage in the history of Zionism. So we have over here a very deep connection between Bialik's response to the pogrom in Kishinev, from there to Jabotinsky's translation of the poem to Russian, Jabotinsky's understanding of Jewish faith following this poem, to the establishment of the Jewish Legion, and a very, very important development in the history of Zionism. So I'll stop over here, and Tamar, maybe I'll try and answer some questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay. The first question is, do you think Bialik's feelings that the Jews did not do enough in Kishinev is accurate?
Okay, so this is a very important and quite famous question. The truth is, and if one wants to read the book I mentioned by Stephen Zipperstein, it's documented over there and in quite a few other places. The truth is, there was some kind of Jewish actions of defense in Kishinev. They weren't all slaughtered without doing anything, and Bialik knew this. However, this struck him as not something that was not enough, and he chose deliberately to write his poem, ignoring those actions of defense, because he had a strong feeling that this was a much wider problem that wasn't specific to the Jews of Kishinev, but Jewish existence in general. And of course, now we know that he was quite right, because you can look at Jewish history, how it developed in the next 2 generations in Eastern and then in all Europe. His observation was correct. So this wasn't historically completely correct, but as a prophecy that had to be said or delivered to the entire Jewish people, it was something he had to say.
Okay, Robert, that answered your question also without even seeing it. There are 2 questions here regarding translations of the poems we read today and last week. Are the translations from Hillel Hawkins open to the public? And could you give some tips about finding the best translations for these poems?
I'm not sure I can give the best tips about this. I know there are some people that are listening to me over here who might do a better job than me. I myself have a very deep admiration to the Halkin translations. I think, to the best of my knowledge, they are available. One should look for them. And if not online, recently Halkin published a book in English about history and poetry. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think at least some of these texts are translated over there.
Okay.
So one should just look at that up in the internet. I think it will come up quite easily. This, I think, was the most recent publication of Halkin in a book.
The translation you used today were also by Halkin?
No.
No.
No. Different translation from quite a few years before. Halkin's translations are new and modern in a way.
All right. Robert Silverman would like to know, where does Lamdam and his epic poem Masada fit in your thinking of great Zionist poetry? I noticed he wasn't in your top 4.
Okay, so he wasn't. Thank you for the question. Lamdan and his Masada are not there just because we have only 4 sessions. If we would have had 5 or 6, he would definitely be there. Lamdan and Masada belong to our next session about creating a new kind of Jew in Zionist in Zionist culture and history. So I'll mention him. We'll speak about, we'll talk about Jabotinsky in order to connect next week's session with today. I'll also mention Chernichovsky, but of course, this idea which the great poet Yitzhak Lamdan came up with, describing Zionism as an act of Masada. Right, we have reached the final point, and we are over here to love, but if we have to die, we'll die with our guns with us. That's a very, very important idea, important poem. It also drew Masada itself, the mountain, and its story into the central of the Zionist thought. So yes, it's just because we don't have enough sessions, but I would love to read that poem too.
Okay, we have here a last comment, not a question. A suggestion that the translation you were using now was David Roski's, but I don't know if that's correct.
I don't think so. No.
Okay.
Is that a suggestion to use his translation?
No. Someone suggested that was what you were using.
Oh.
But someone else suggested Route Nevo. So.
Let's just look at it for 1 second. I think it's written down. 1 second.
Let's see.
Oh.
No.
It actually isn't mentioned. Okay, so let me look it up, and I'll give the right information.
You can give us this answer next week when we're.
Okay, I'll find out.
When we're moving ahead. That's fine. Thank you very much, Asael. If there's no more questions, we'll say goodbye now, and we hope to see everybody here with us next week to continue in our next stage of poetry and Zionism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamar.